You are listening to Verba Manit, where words do remain. Welcome to the third episode of the podcast series Right the Wrongs. Every Wednesday and Saturday, Right the Wrongs raises public awareness on pressing human rights issues and creates an incubator of activism. I'm Mason.
And I'm Melissa.
And we're your hosts for today. This episode is the first in a two-part series where we shed light on the intersection between human rights and the climate crisis. So to start off, Melissa, how is climate change linked to human rights?
Human rights and climate change intersect precisely on the question of climate refugees. I'll explain all about them in a minute, but I would like to define the terms first. The term climate refugee doesn't actually exist in international law. According to international law, to be considered a refugee, one has to, first of all, cross international borders, and second, exhibit a fear of persecution in their home country due to belonging to a certain group based on race, religion, etc. The correct term is persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. However, for the convenience of this podcast and for its accessibility in mainstream media, we will keep on using the term climate refugee.
Now that we know exactly what this term entails, who exactly are these climate refugees?
Well, we already know that they face a situation of forced displacement. This displacement can occur due to two reasons. One, due to a natural disaster, and two, due to a lack of resources, such as food insecurity. In 2018, the majority of United Nations member states adopted the Global Compact on Refugees. This framework acknowledges that both environmental degradation and natural disasters are more and more involved with the other factors that cause population displacements.
So why and how worried should we be about their situation?
The situation is getting critical. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, in 2017, there were 18.8 million cases of internal displacement due to a natural disaster. Also, it's important to know that most displacements are, in fact, internal. For example, in Bangladesh, we see a trend of people moving away from river deltas and into the city.
So we see a trend of urbanization?
Not exactly. Urbanization is no longer the sole factor at play here. People are leaving rural areas because they are experiencing an important case of food insecurity. Rising seas turn fresh river water salty. Increasingly frequent floods are causing perfectly good land to turn sterile from all the salt deposits the water leaves.
You mentioned Bangladesh. Is this a country we should be paying particular attention to?
Well, Bangladesh is one famous case indeed. Bangladesh's population is especially vulnerable because of the geographical location of the country. Tropical storms are a regular occurrence, and their impact is worsened by the land's low elevation.
Now help me paint a clearer picture of this. In Bangladesh, people are moving from the country to the city. Is their life suddenly looking brighter after leaving?
Unfortunately, their living conditions don't usually improve once they are in the city. For example, in Dhaka, its capital, an estimated 1.5 million of the 5 million inhabitants of the city's slums come from the Bay of Bengal, where the deltas are. However, the risks aren't decreased either. The slums are also built on a land with very low elevation, which is at risk for inundation.
What about the government's place in all of this?
The government, for now, has only provided some temporary solutions. For instance, at least 2,500 shelters have been built to help those impacted by natural disasters.
2,500 hardly seems enough for a country of 163 million people.
Yeah, and it doesn't really get to the root of the problem either.
I assume the problem is more environmental than anything else.
You're absolutely right. Here's the situation. Most water now comes from the ground because rivers have become too polluted. The constant pumping of water is causing cities to sink into the ground and thus become even more vulnerable to flooding. Combined with the rising sea levels, this could mean that by 2050, 17% of Bangladesh's land will be underwater.
That seems like a very dire situation. So just to give our listeners a bit more of a positive perspective, what solutions are available to us today?
Some countries are asking for the opening of international borders for its climate refugees, especially from the main culprits of global pollution like the United States. The government of Bangladesh, like many others, cannot handle this alone. Climate refugees are a global problem and they require a global solution. Experts say that by 2050, 50 million people will seek shelter in another country if sea levels continue to rise at this rate. 18 million of these people will be from Bangladesh. We could also turn to refugee law, which is becoming more and more responsible for bringing human rights law and climate change closer. Thus, moving on from climate migration, we can turn to climate justice through climate reparations.
So can you tell me more about these climate reparations?
Yes. So, reparations, as a general term, is usually a form of compensation to make up for wrongdoing committed by one party to another. While climate reparations can work in different ways, it is a method of compensation from, essentially, the largest polluters to the most affected. This stems from a sense of inequality and exploitation. Richer countries are actively benefiting economically from emitting more, while underdeveloped or developing countries emit much less. But the consequences affect all of us, which is why today we will attempt to answer the question, would it be a right for the lesser emitting countries to receive reparations for the damage other countries caused?
Now, why exactly do we need climate reparations?
Well, the article The Case for Climate Reparations from the Financial Times makes the case that there are two ways forward, either towards climate reparations or climate colonialism, as it was termed. So the argument is that either we use reparations to mitigate the inequalities due to climate change, or we have a situation termed climate colonialism, where the wealthiest people and nation would survive potential climate catastrophes, whereas poorer ones will be devastated.
That sounds like a really tricky situation. So how exactly can reparations be implemented to avoid climate colonialism?
So there are two main ways in which reparations can be implemented. Mimi Scheller from the Bulletin suggests either using a corrective justice or tort litigation approach.
Tell me more.
The corrective justice approach entails higher emitters of greenhouse gases to compensate the amount of harm to those affected within an international jurisdiction, perhaps using an international compensation commission of sorts. Now, as I see it, there are obvious advantages and disadvantages to this method. For instance, it does allow most countries to build, invest in, and develop climate resilience, like greener sources of energy. It also incentivizes wealthier and higher emitting countries to lower their carbon footprint fast.
There seems to be a caveat. Don't you think that this approach is more reparative than preventative?
Yeah, but then again, climate change-related crises and natural disasters are already happening and need to be addressed. Another point is that the money offered in reparations ideally goes towards building higher climate resilience. This means that the money has to be tightly controlled to ensure it goes towards investing in climate resilience, rather than be taken by corrupted hands or used for harmful projects.
What about the second option you mentioned, tort litigation?
Yes, it essentially means suing oil companies for damage incurred. Tort is defined as an act or omission that gives rise to injury or harm to another. Reparations for those badly affected by greenhouse gas emissions would be given by oil companies rather than by countries.
How could this work?
Well, companies could be investigated and held responsible for a specific harmful consequence. As we saw with the case of tobacco companies, this can work especially if the corporation was aware of the harm but covered it up. In fact, as scholar Diana Hinge-Salili wrote, the call for compensation for damage is supported by well-established rules of international law. A good example would be an island, such as Vanuatu, which could be given an opportunity for reparations owed by the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage under the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
And how viable is this method?
I would say that it could really work since there are already systems in place, but it could potentially leave out government's responsibility in the emission of greenhouse gases.
Now that we've gotten to the ways in which reparations could be paid, could you expand a little bit further into the moral and logical justifications of climate reparations?
Sure. Beyond avoiding climate colonialism, reparations also deal with problems of climate refugees. Setting systems in place for countries to build climate resilience will avoid an excess of refugees migrating to northern countries.
Could this be a possible preventative measure for northern countries to take in order to avoid an even higher influx of refugees?
Yeah, the problem of refugees represents perhaps an even higher cost than reparations. The world can hardly accommodate the refugees we have today, so decreasing the number of displaced people is definitely a priority. Beyond that, however, we need to understand that climate migration is fueled by the global north's unconscionable way of life. They have a moral obligation to either deal with the consequences and take refugees in, or pay reparations to those who are harmed. Of course, we would rather deal with as few consequences as possible by acting now.
Unfortunately, it seems as though the question of irreparable damage has already been posed.
Absolutely, but the global north has been profiting off of the fossil fuel industry for a very long time and continues to do so. For example, the US is responsible for 25% of emissions since 1751, but only makes up about 4.25% of the worldwide population. In contrast, the entire continent of Africa comprises 17% of the global human population and yet only contributed 4% to global emissions.
Those are quite crazy numbers, and it really puts things into perspective. By the way, I noticed you used the term global north rather loosely. Are you implying that the countries belonging to the global north, as you put it, should in general be the ones paying reparations?
Well, I do think that this is a very valid debate to have, since an argument can be made that countries like China and India also emit very high levels of greenhouse gases, although they are not historical emitters like Europe and the US. However, I think it depends on which of the approaches that I mentioned is taken, which in turn could produce a framework to charge those responsible for the damages incurred, whether those paying are oil companies or entire countries.
That's definitely some food for thought. To close it off, do you have any remarks about climate reparations in general that you'd like to remain with our audience?
I do have one last quote that I think expresses most of what I said. In the article The Case for Climate Reparations, published by Foreign Policy, it is said that climate reparations are better understood as a systemic approach to redistributing resources and changing policies and institutions that have perpetuated harm rather than a discrete exchange of money or of apologies for past wrongdoing.
That brings us to the end of today's episode on climate justice. Feel free to engage with us on our social media channels. Do you think countries who don't belong to the global north but pollute a significant amount should also be paying reparations? And do you believe that richer countries have the obligation to welcome climate refugees? Let us know by following us on Facebook and Instagram, and join us for further discussions on a Telegram group, or leave us a comment at theverbamanetpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was written by Tatiana and Melissa, produced by Tanthe, and brought to you by Right the Wrongs under Verba Manet. The next podcast in our series on climate justice will focus on Indigenous peoples and privilege. It will be released on the 24th of February. You can find the programme wherever you find our podcasts, bringing you detailed updates on pressing human rights issues. Till next time, take care.